You're watching Let the Quran Speak, and now we answer your questions. If you have a question, visit our website, QuranSpeaks.com. Dr. Shabir, the question is, why do some Imams shout when giving the khutbah? I don't like shouting. It hurts my ears and makes me feel stressed out. I try to skip Fridays when I know the shouty Imams will be there. Why can't the khutbah be positive, gentle, and inviting? Shouty Imams, that's the first time I've heard that word.
Yeah, a lot of people have that concern. On the other hand, Safiyyah, there are some people who feel good, like they're there and the Imam is like really screaming at them and they feel, okay, that, we're really in our place now, and they need that they feel they need that as a kind of a spiritual injection somehow like this, and they come out feeling it was a great khutbah, right?
When I think about churches, for example, there's those two different approaches as well, right?
Yeah.
There's some of the priests are very emotional and energetic and, fire and brimstones, and the other ones are gentle, right? And loving.
Yes. There are reasons why the, preachers take on the fire and brimstone type of approach. And, sometimes it's because they believe in it so strongly, but sometimes it's because they know that their point is weak. So they have to, shore it up with this fire and brimstone. In fact, many years ago, I read a book on public speaking, and it related a story about a preacher who had his notes, and in the margin he wrote notes to himself about how to intone or emphasize certain things. And at one point he said, point here is weak, preach fire and brimstone, So, but more seriously, the khutbah does not have to always be serious. It can be informative, it can be educational, and it could be delivered as a university lecture style. But of course, there are certain components of the khutbah, of the Friday sermon, which must be in place to meet the traditional requirements. One is that there should be praise of God. Two, there should be the what is called the shahadatain, the bearing witness that there's no God but God and Muhammad is the prophet of God. There should be the recitation of a verse of the Quran and a citation from some hadith to meet all of the requirements which are given by the various schools of Islamic jurisprudence. Now, once these requirements are fulfilled, it can be a more serious khutbah, it can be a less serious one, and so on. Does the Imam have to be angry? Well, it is reported that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when he delivered the sermon, his eyes would be red and he would be angry and he would raise his voice. So maybe this is where many of the Imams take their cue from. They want to follow this literally. But we should understand how things are related about the Prophet, peace be upon him. Sometimes a person saw the Prophet in that particular state that struck him, and that person related this as if this was generally the case about the Prophet, peace be upon him, because people 1400 years ago, when they related things, they didn't think about all the nuances and so on with which we might want to relate something today. And even to this day, when people relate things, they say they did, as if they only saw one person did by that, they do it, or they are doing, and so on. People generalize like this. It's hard to imagine that the Prophet, peace be upon him, always had red eyes and always raised his voice and was always angry during the khutbah. In fact, it is mentioned that in one particular khutbah, he was actually smiling. So it shows it wasn't always in the same state. So the Muslim preacher can vary his states. Sometimes smiling, if the point, is a slightly pleasant one. If he could be angry, if the point requires some anger to be shown, because it's a serious point, people really need to get the point and see the anger. Otherwise, there'll be a mismatch. You couldn't be smiling and you're talking about death at the same time. It's not going to go hand in hand. So depending on the subject matter and so on. Then there's the question of how to keep the audience attentive. So maybe, this is a challenge. Can we joke in the khutbah? Well, some of the scholars would hesitate at this point because they think that this khutbah should be a solemn and serious affair, because this is like a once in a week. It's a kind of an official pronouncement. It's almost like the State of the Union address, but it's given like once a week. So you need some sort of seriousness to go with it. But if it's a longer khutbah than, let's say, 5 minutes or so, then you need to vary things. Sometimes less serious, sometimes a bit jovial, smiling, pausing. Sometimes people pause when they can't remember what they have to say, right? They're collecting their thoughts. But the preacher can pause deliberately in order to register a point. It just as, when you're reading a book, you come to the end of a chapter, there's a little bit of white space, and then new text to follow at the beginning of the next chapter. So that's how the human mind works. We need little breaks in between. So the preacher can pause just so that people have a chance to absorb the point being made, and then you move on to the next point, and so on. So there are all of these techniques which preachers should employ, and screaming all of the time, is going to turn many people off. Maybe some people like it that way, but a lot of intellectual people are, people who are intellectually inclined, they will think, what is this? And of course, they will try to find other alternatives than coming to listen.
I personally don't like yelling in a khutbah, so I like a gentle, calm approach myself.
I like that too. And that's why in my khutbahs, I try to be gentle most of the time. Sometimes I do get angry.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Muslim Media Hub, the new home of Let the Quran Speak.
Here we spread positivity and good. We help people experience the beauty of Islam and help them appreciate and understand Muslims.
This beautiful building we purchased at cost $2.3 million.
Yeah, we've already raised a third of that money, and with your help, inshallah, we can pay off the rest.
So we're looking for people who can give $1,000 each. If you can be part of the select group, that's amazing.
Otherwise, just please give whatever you can. Every dollar counts.
It's our collective responsibility to share the message of Islam with our fellow human beings. Please help us continue this good work.
It's a sadaqah jariyah, something that will continue to be a benefit to the Muslim community long after Safiyyah and I are gone.
Please support our work at muslimmediahub.com.
Your support is zakat eligible and tax deductible.
May Allah bless you and your loved ones today and always. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.